Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff, too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Well, those of us old enough to remember Bob Cole's iconic call, "They're going home," also remember what was at stake that day in Philadelphia. That was back in 1976. Us versus them was not Canada versus the Soviets this time. It was the Stanley Cup champions against the Russian Red Army. But there was pride on the line to the point of briefly turning bullies into heroes. Michael Farber has more on a famous and infamous game 40 years ago today.
40 years ago, the Broad Street Bullies, properly known as the Philadelphia Flyers, were the scourge of hockey. But on January 11th, 1976, for the first and maybe the only time, the Flyers wore the white hats. They were facing the unbeaten Red Army in its final game of a North American tour.
As far as this game is concerned, I believe it's going to be the highlight of my life. If we win, I'm going to be sky high, and if we lose, I think it'll be worse than dying.
In his pregame speech, Coach Fred Shiro said, "They have the Iron Curtain in Russia. Let's show them the Iron Curtain of North America." They mussed up the Red Army from the opening faceoff with what Coach Konstantin Loktev would call animal hockey.
Fires that close man. That Kylabo again. Harlamov is really belted by Van Impe.
Soviet star Valery Harlamov crumpled to the ice where he remained for a minute. Loktev called his players to the bench in protest, and referee Lloyd Gilmore responded with a delay of game penalty. And so, with no promise the Bullies would play nice, the Red Army streamed to its dressing room.
They're going home. They're going home. Yeah, they're going home. Can you imagine?
But there was a question of a $200,000 guarantee. No play, no pay.
The Soviet Army team is back on the ice. The delay has been approximately 15 minutes.
The Flyers won 4-1. And Joe Watson, who would never score a shorthanded goal in 919 NHL games, had one that day. Shiro liked to joke that Watson's shorty set Soviet hockey back 25 years. The Broad Street Bullies might have been the barbarians at the gate, but they were our barbarians.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's do this, everybody. How are you? It's Tim Hanlon, your host and congenial one at that, welcoming you to yet another episode of the fun-filled extravaganza we call Good Seats Still Available. Yes, it's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We do this every week. I appreciate you finding us, and welcome, as always, to the proceedings. We appreciate it to no end, and I think the tone is set. The table is ready for our conversation as laid out from that clip from 2016 on the CBC. No, sorry, that was TSN. We'll talk about CBC in a second. The TSN cable network, which is the sort of Canadian version of ESPN SportsCenter back in 2016, when they were celebrating the 40th anniversary of what is actually this week going to be the 48th anniversary of our topic of the week, and that is the Super Series 76, and in particular, the final game of that series between the Philadelphia Flyers, the defending NHL Stanley Cup champions that year, that season, and the Red Army team of the Soviet Union back in the day. The Super Series 76, as you may remember, was one of these parade of exhibition series that were dominant and in the 1970s in professional hockey. We've talked about a couple of WHA versions and such previously, but Super Series 76 was the first of the Super Series that was team-based, not sort of all-star based per se. And in particular, this was a series of games played between two club teams in the then Soviet Championship League, one the Red Army team, and the other being the team known as the Soviet Wings, against a variety of teams in the National Hockey League: the Rangers, the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Bruins, Pittsburgh Penguins, the Buffalo Sabres, the Blackhawks of Chicago, the New York Islanders, and perhaps most famously of all of those 8 games played in that Super Series 76 was January 11th, 1976. Live and exclusive from the Spectrum was this amazing game that took on a whole sort of host of different sort of stories and various tensions between the Flyers and the Red Army team. That is the topic this week as we get into our conversation with our guest, Ed Gruver. He, the author of the brand new book called The Game That Saved the NHL, the Broad Street Bullies, the Soviet Red Machine, and Super Series 76. And we'll get into why Ed feels that this was the game that saved the NHL and all the sort of tension and drama and buildup before this game, that being in the series itself, what transpired in the series, why the series occurred in the first place, and the legacy, if you will, of this game. A very hard-fought game, as you can imagine. The Broad Street Bullies, having gained their name in the NHL, relatively new club, as we know from the NHL's fits and starts driven kind of expansion in the late 60s, early 70s. And the Flyers really made their mark on the NHL and was very much the representative best of the league at that time as this series was winding down. And mayhem, drama, the Soviet team walking off the ice or skating off the ice, as you heard there famously called on the CBC call, they're going home. They're going home. It's an interesting story. And if you're not familiar with it, stay tuned. I think you'll find it intriguing and will really shape, I think, a little bit of some of your interest in the NHL today and maybe sort of harken back to where it mattered a lot more on a whole bunch of different levels than just simply making Gary Bettman and the various franchises just that much more rich, I guess, and making a buck or two. This is the fascinating story of that game from January 11th of 1976, and I look forward to presenting it to you in moments' time. The book, again, is called The Game That Saved the NHL, and you can find it wherever good books are found, but of course we appreciate it to no end if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode numbered 322, our soon-to-be-had conversation with Ed Gruver, and you'll find a convenient couple of links to Amazon, where you can get the hardcover or Kindle versions of the book, and we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love. We appreciate that very much, as I'm sure it will Ed and his publisher, Lions Press. All right, so let's waste no more time. Let's get right into that conversation. We had it just before the holidays, and we are excited to bring it to you now. Here it is, and please, as always, enjoy. Let's start from the start. Where is your adjunct to this story, both professionally, personally, and all that kind of stuff? Why is this story? How does this hit your radar, and why?
I grew up in that era. I grew up in North Jersey. We were in the Newark area, just outside of New York. We were like 15 minutes drive from Manhattan. So I grew up watching hockey. I grew up, watching the New York Rangers at that time, and their primary rival was the Philadelphia Flyers, along with Boston Bruins. I should add that as well. But they had a tremendous playoff series in 1974 that may still rank as the most physical NHL playoff series of all time. I mean, it was pretty rough on both sides. So I grew up watching those games, and even though I was a Rangers fan, I could appreciate, how hard the Flyers played, how much skill they had, and knew that they were more than what their team reputation was, that they were the Broad Street Bullies and that they won by fighting. I knew from watching them that they were more than that. And as I grew older, I covered some hockey games for some Central PA newspapers, and covered some of the Flyers games, and really started to look deeper into the Flyers and their history. And this game stood out because I came across a quote early on from Fred Shero, who had said, he was the Flyers coach at that time, and he said that this game against the Russians is a bigger deal for us than the two previous Stanley Cups that we had won. They had won in 74 when they beat the Bobby Orr, Phil Esposito, Boston Bruins, and then they won in 75 when they beat the famous French Connection line in Buffalo. So, I mean, that was pretty high praise from Fred Shero, pretty important words to say that this one-game showdown with the Central Red Army team from the Soviet Union was more important to him and his team than the two previous Stanley Cup championships that they had just won.
Yeah, and it's also part of an evolving legacy, right? I mean, people forget that the Flyers, really only came onto the scene not till 1967, right? When the NHL realized there's actually, they can expand beyond 6 teams easily enough. But that's a pretty rapid ascent by today's standards, maybe not so much, but to go from that to back-to-back world championships, or at least NHL championships, wink, wink, nod, nod. That's a full head of steam, right? Going into whatever this event we're going to get into in a second.
And I think people, didn't like the fact that the Flyers were the first, non-original 6 team to win a Stanley Cup. People forget that. The Flyers were the first expansion team to win a Stanley Cup. As you mentioned, the league expanded in 67 beyond the 6 teams. And, I think they found fault with a lot of things, particularly the Flyers' physical style. And, the Flyers were a physical team. There's no debating that. And there's no way to say that wasn't true. But to say that they were the only team doing it is not realistic at all. I mean, the big bad Bruins of that era, who won 2 Stanley Cups, I mean, they weren't named the big bad Bruins just because of, Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. I mean, they had some tough physical guys playing for that team. The St. Louis Blues, who were coached by legend Scotty Bowman, were known as a pretty physical hockey team. They had beaten up the Flyers pretty badly in Stanley Cup series, and that beating really prompted Ed Snyder and GM Keith Allen to start building a bigger, tougher team, because as Ed Snyder said at the time, we are not going to go through this again. We have a lot of small guys who are getting beaten up in the playoffs by bigger guys. From now on, we're going to be the aggressors.
So let's put this in perspective. So the Flyers are the 2-time back-to-back NHL champions in the mid-70s, the 74 and 75 Cups. Describe what this Super Series in 1976 was going to be. And frankly, there's a little bit of history with this idea of then Soviet teams coming across the pond, shall we say, to play in the continent, right? Because as we've seen and heard in our discussions around the old WHA, right, there's a legendary Summit Series in 1972 and another one in 74,
right,
where Canadian pride was on full display against sort of the terror from afar. there is a little bit of it's clear from an event perspective. There's a lot of opportunity with that, but this one's a little different, and maybe you can kind of sort of set the stage for us on that.
Yeah, this was different. It was really groundbreaking because it was the first time that you had Soviet teams from the Soviet League, not a national team, like as you mentioned, that represented the Soviet Union in 72 Summit Series against, NHL players, an NHL All-Star team. And then in 74, the Russians returned with a national team to play a Summit Series against the WHA, the World Hockey Association stars, guys like, it was an aging Gordie Howe and Bobby Hull and some of those players. But this was the first time, Super Series 76, which was actually starting in December of 75 and would carry over into January of 76, was the first time that you had two Soviet League teams, the Central Red Army team and the Soviet Wings, coming to North America to play 8 games against National Hockey League teams, not an NHL All-Star team, but actual National Hockey League clubs. So that's why this series was groundbreaking. It was the first time you ever had teams from the Soviet League playing teams from the NHL. And
the motivation was what? Coming from whom? Who wanted this?
Both sides wanted it because the Soviets wanted it because they saw that playing NHL teams could only fine-tune their game for the upcoming Winter Olympics. The NHL wanted it because in 72 they had been shocked by the Soviet national team, and it was an 8-game series, and a lot of NHL writers at the time prior to the series thought that the NHL was going to win all 8 games. It was going to be an 8-0 sweep. Well, it came down to the NHL having to pull out a game 8 victory in Moscow on a Paul Henderson goal against Vladislav Tretiak, and that set off New Year's Eve style celebrations, even though it was September in Canada and throughout parts of North America. But the NHL wanted it because their feeling was, when we're playing the Soviets in early September, our guys aren't really in shape yet. Year-round training at that time wasn't what it is today. A lot of guys had off-season jobs. They weren't really in hockey shape. The Soviet players in the meantime were basically training and playing hockey and practicing 11 months out of the year. So the NHL saw that as a huge advantage for the Russians. And they were like, if we play again, we're going to have a situation where we're going to play in season, and we're not going to put together a all-star team where guys have to get used to playing with each other. We're going to pick 8 teams that you can come over here and play. So that was basically the ground rules for this series, and it was going to be confined largely to teams in the Northeast and Midwest. They didn't go any further west than Chicago because the NHL didn't think that it was economically feasible to send a Russian team out to, say, LA to play the Kings for 1 game. They didn't want to deal with those travel expenses. So it was basically 8 teams in the Northeast and in the Midwest, and they would play 4 games against the Central Red Army team and 4 games against the Soviet Wings. And the schedule makers indulged their sense of drama by having the 2 league champions, the 2 best teams in the hockey world at that time, the Philadelphia Flyers and the Soviet Red Army team, play in the 8th and final game in Philadelphia in the Spectrum.
Yeah, and the idea, right, was it wasn't even sort of a standings-based competition. It was just basically a series of 8 games. Red Army playing 4, Soviet Wings playing 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think even the NHL teams shared the experience. There were 8 different NHL teams, correct?
Correct. Now, I should say too that there was some concern on the NHL side when they found out that the Soviet teams were basically adding ringers to their two clubs that were going to come over here. That they were rating other Soviet League teams for some of their best players that they were going to add to Central Red Army, and that they were going to add to Soviet wings. And some of the NHL players at the time, like Phil Esposito, by this time was with the New York Rangers. They were going to be playing the Red Army team in Madison Square Garden. And when Esposito heard about, the Red Army team adding players from other Soviet League teams, he's there, why can't we add like Marcel Dion from the LA Kings, or why can't we add, some all-stars from other players or from other teams? Because that's obviously what they're doing. So even though the games were billed as, quote unquote exhibition games, friendlies, as the Russians called them, it was pretty clear that the Soviets were not treating them as mere exhibitions. They were treating them as, a test of Soviet hockey versus NHL hockey.
Yeah, and look, and again, the 72 and 74 Summit Series prior to that, right? Certainly, I wouldn't call them, it's almost like Rocky movies in some respects, but it certainly set the stage for sort of that tension, that international sort of drama and intrigue that sort of comes with it. But as you said before, right, this is unique by comparison because, number one, these are club teams and featuring some of the best ones in both leagues. And two, this is literally smack dab in the middle of both of their, if you will, regular seasons.
Yes, and smack dab in the middle of the Cold War that was going on. And I should preface my remarks too by saying that the 72 Summit Series was also famous, apart from its drama, for the slashing penalty from Bobby Clarke, who happened to be the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers, on the Soviets' best player, Valery Harlamov. He was kind of the Pavel Bure of his era. I mean, he was the original Russian Rocket for fans who know about Bure. But that lent all kinds of drama and controversy to both the Summit Series and the upcoming Super Series, because the Russians want to know, well, is Clarke going to deliberately go after Harlamov again? Is Dave Schultz going to intentionally pound one of our guys? What are we going to be walking into when we go into Philadelphia?
All right, tell me about sort of the games leading up to this sort of final, because obviously the book is primarily focused as that game against the Flyers, against the Soviet team to be, obviously the exclamation point for this. But this is the first time that these two leagues were really playing each other head to head. I'm curious, number one, how these games sort of went. This was sort of in late December, early January, 75 into 76. And I guess I'm also curious as to why these particular teams in the NHL were chosen. I mean, you mentioned the geographical thing, but the Flyers were two-time champions. Get that? That's probably best of breed. The Montreal Canadiens at the time were probably the best team that season, and then to become the eventual champions that season of the NHL. So that makes a lot of sense. But why the Penguins? Why the Rangers? Why even the why the Bruins?
Yeah, because they were considered, Bruins and Rangers were considered, flagship franchises of the NHL. They're part of the original six. They're kind of like original six royalty. Plus, the Bruins boasted Bobby Orr. He had never played against the Soviet superstars like Harlamov and Tretiak and Boris Mikhailov. And, there was a lot of interest in seeing Orr playing against the Russians because he had been injured at the time of the 72 Summit Series. He would have played then, but Bobby had a knee injury and wasn't able to participate in that series. So there was a lot of interest in seeing Bobby Orr, going against the Russians. And there was interest in seeing, the Soviet teams on, ice in famous arenas like Madison Square Garden, the Boston Garden, the Montreal Forum. The Buffalo Sabres were chosen because they had been Stanley Cup finalists the year before. They had played the Flyers and had lost in 6 games, but they had the famed French Connection line. The Pittsburgh Penguins and the New York Islanders were chosen because they had gone deep into the playoffs the year before. They had played a great semifinal series. So basically these teams were chosen on, what they had done the year before and also what they had done in past years. Some teams, again, they could have chosen the Kings, but the NHL didn't want to foot the bill for the expenses to send the Russians out to LA for, a 1-game deal. Also, the Toronto Maple Leafs, they were offered a chance, but their owner did not want, he said at that time, he did not want Soviet players skating on Montreal, or excuse me, on Toronto Forum ice. So that's why the Russians did not play the Maple Leafs in that series. But basically, those teams, again, were chosen because of their competitiveness and because of their history and their tradition and their breeding.
Well, it's interesting because the first number of games certainly didn't seem to play out, I guess, maybe as NHL officials might have thought. I mean, Red Army beat the Rangers on the 28th of 75, December 28th, 75, 7-3. And then the Wings beat the Penguins by almost identical score, 7-4 the next night.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It obviously had to be a bit demoralizing, but the tide did turn, though, on that New Year's Eve game against the Canadiens, the Red Army team. And maybe this was sort of a beginning of maybe the real best of knocking at each other's heads, and maybe a real truer test, perhaps, of where the best of the best stood on both sides.
Yeah, and from all accounts, and I've watched that game. I mean, you can watch it on YouTube. I have a DVD of it. The Canadians,
is Foster Hewitt calling the action?
I believe he is.
It's got to be, of course.
Yeah, the Canadians outplayed the Central Red Army team throughout the game. It's only superior goaltending by Tretiak that saved the Russians from being embarrassed on the scoreboard. That's the only reason they came away with a 3-3 tie in that game. But I think
he was outshot something like by a 3. I think it was like 38-13 or something like that.
Yeah, but that stat is misleading when you're dealing with Russian teams, because they're all outshot in almost every game, but yet they win the majority of their games. And the reason they're outshot is because they play a European style where they go more for strategic passing than they do for high volume shots on goal. The Russians look at it as if they take a shot on goal and it's blocked or turned away, to them, that's a turnover. So, they value high percentage shots. They'll hold the puck, they'll pass it, they'll move it around until they can maneuver into what they feel is the highest percentage shot possible for them. So they are going to be routinely outshot when playing NHL teams, because the NHL teams play dump and chase. They'll blast away from the blue line, and the Russian teams at that time really didn't. You didn't really see them doing it. They would carry the puck in past the blue line and, try to score on the best shot possible. So it's just a different outlook on attacking at that point. So, the Russians being outshot was not anything new. What was new is, as you said, that they were pretty well handling the NHL teams, except for the top 3 teams, which were the Canadians, who they were fortunate to get a tie against. The Wings went into Buffalo and were manhandled. Then, of course, it was left to the Red Army to play the NHL champion Flyers in Philadelphia.
All right, so set the tone then for this game. This is the last of the 8 games being played on January 11th, 1976. Why, given the Sabres beating the Wings that one game earlier in the month, and that tie between the Canadiens and the Red Army team, being the 2 bright lights, I guess, of the NHL performance against these 2 teams at that point, what's left to prove, and why does this game take any sort of greater tension or drama versus the other games? Like what was it? Is it mostly after the fact of this game, or was it also leading up to this game that there was something unique and different about this? Was it because this was the current champion of the league in the NHL, the Flyers and the Red Army? Was that the ticket, or were there other things afoot before the game started?
I think there are definitely other things afoot. I mean, we had the Russian Philadelphia connection going back to 72 with the Bobby Clark, Valery Harlamov slashing situation that forced Harlamov, out of the Summit Series for a game. And then when he did come back, he was clearly not the same player he had been before that because of the injury. So you had that. You also had the fact that Fred Shero, the Flyers coach, had visited Moscow after the Flyers' first Stanley Cup victory for training techniques. He went over there to find out what the Russians were doing, and he brought some of that back and incorporated it into what the Flyers were doing. And there's no question that Shero coaching the NHL champions was heavily influenced by the Soviet style of hockey. So that was another connection. You also had the fact that the Broad Street Bullies were, internationally renowned. I mean, when Shero came back from Moscow, he brought back with him a pretty sizable pile of newspapers and articles, talking about the Broad Street Bullies, talking about, Dave the Hammer Schultz and Bobby Clark and Moose DuPont and, all these players that the Russians were pretty well versed with. So you had a lot of these things, coming together. And then, of course, you had the fact that this final game did match the champions of the two leagues, the Soviet League champion Central Red Army, the NHL champion Philadelphia Flyers. And the game is taking place in Philadelphia, of course, the birthplace of American freedom and democracy. And so all these things coming together at the same time, really built this game up into something more than a hockey game. Freddie Shero said at the time that, the pressure was such on his team that they felt like they were suffocating, in the days leading up to the game. This is a team that had just played for and won 2 Stanley Cups, and the pressure that they're feeling now is far greater than anything they had experienced before. And, talking to those Flyer players, I think that no team in NHL history before and in the future is ever going to feel the pressure that the Flyers felt for that one game, because no team is ever going to be put in this situation again where they're representing not only their city, but they're representing the league. They're representing, decades of hockey tradition. They're representing the most famous trophy in sports history, the Stanley Cup. And, now they're representing also, democracy against communism, North America versus the Soviet Union, all these political overtones that are taking place. You had protests outside the Spectrum that day. You had fights breaking out on this arena steps, blood being spilled. You had banners inside the arena protesting the Soviets, and the Soviets refusing to take the ice until the banners were removed. There was a lot going on. And the Flyer players themselves were like, this game, we realized this game was much more than a hockey game. It had become a political event.
Was this kind of stuff happening in the other games, or was it only unique to this one?
It was pretty unique to this one. I think it was building up. There were some situations in the other arenas where, fans, were highly, obviously highly in favor of their home team against the Russians, more so than they would be, say, if the Bruins were playing, the LA Kings. I mean, you had a whole different atmosphere than you have now when you have the Bruins playing, the Central Red Army. I mean, it's a whole different thing. Same thing, fans in New York. The Rangers playing Central Red Army was much different than the Rangers playing, the Toronto Maple Leafs, which, because it was new, it was different. The players from Russia were not known commodities like the NHL players were. They played a different style. There was just a lot going on with these games, but it really built up because of the Flyers game and because of the situation that, no one had beaten Red Army. They had gone 2-0-1 against the NHL teams that they had played. And so it was left to the Flyers to beat them and uphold the honor, so to say, of, NHL hockey. And that's why you had the NHL president, Clarence Campbell, making a special trip to the Flyers locker room in the Spectrum that day before the first period. And Campbell was a guy who didn't like Broad Street Bullies. He didn't even want to be on the ice to hand them the Stanley Cup the previous 2 years. And all of a sudden he's in their dressing room before the game saying, boys, you got to win this game.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sportswear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Ed Snyder had a particularly sore approach to this team, the Russian officials, and all that kind of stuff, dating back to, from what I understand, in some of the writing in your book, to the actual formation of this series in the first place, right? So, it maybe a little bit about Ed Snyder, the owner of this franchise, because it almost feels like he took almost personal umbrage to some of this to this game too, adding even another level of intrigue, shall we say?
Yeah, a lot of it was personal for Ed Snyder. At that time, Russian Jews were not being treated very well by the Soviet government. And Ed Snyder, made no secret about the fact that he didn't like Russia. He didn't like the Soviet players. I mean, he didn't like the Soviet Union. And at a pregame, it was supposed to be a goodwill luncheon. Turned out to be anything but that. But Ed Snyder had approached Flyers, one of the Flyers announcers, Gene Hart, who spoke Russian, and asked him to, give him a few words that he could greet the Russians with at the beginning of the banquet. And Gene Hart told him, a few words that he could use. And Ed Snyder said later that when he stood up to speak and he looked over at the Soviet players and coaches that he just couldn't bring himself to greet them in any kind of, hospitable fashion. He basically just, gave a very cold welcome and sat down again. And so, yeah, he was not, a fan of the Soviet Union or Russian hockey. And, his role in this would become pretty clear later on in the first period when the Russians would leave the ice in protest, and there would have to be an emergency meeting between the Russian coaches. The head coach was Konstantin Loktev, and also with Ed Snyder and Clarence Campbell and Scotty Morrison and the NHL brass. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but again, Ed Snyder's role in this was to try to, get the Russians to get back on the ice and continue the game.
All right, well, let's talk about that. But leading into that, though, too, and I think you kind of danced around it a little bit, is well, you said it earlier. I mean, the national and international reputation of this Flyers team that had won 2 consecutive championships was this the bully kind of sort of atmosphere, almost like to the point of like the goon squad kind of approach to hockey, right? Rough and tumble and missing teeth and all that kind of stuff. And my guess is that the Russian team and the propaganda, if you will, literally and figuratively, was playing that up too, that they didn't really sort of perhaps think that this team was more than just that, and then bullying their way to winning games and stuff. So I guess Snyder probably internalized that as well. But it's ironic, right? Because, well, you described the game, right? Because that first period kind of sets the tone, and it certainly didn't lack for physicality. And that certainly is a hallmark of the Flyers game at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing to remember too is when you watch the Soviet teams play back then, they weren't angels either. I mean, they were known in international competition for spearing, for hitting guys, behind the knee with their sticks. Phil Esposito, I know, really disliked the Russians and playing against the Russians because he considered them dirtier than any NHL team that he played against, because he thought they were sneaky dirty, that they would do things not blatantly, but they would do things to try to injure you and get you out of the game. So Bobby Clarke knew this. He had played against them, and he told his teammates to, watch out for this kind of stuff. And Freddie Shero knew it as well and did the same. But yeah, the Russians were a little bit leery of going into Philadelphia. But their thing was, if they could get the Flyers off their game, maybe by doing some of these sneaky kind of things that they were accustomed to doing, that maybe they could draw penalties and they could get the Flyers in shorthanded situations, and the Russians would be on the power play, and then they could start racking up some goals as they did in the other games. But Bobby Clarke told his teammates, whatever they do to try to get you off your game, just stay calm, play it cool. And Freddie Shero instituted what was a pretty solid game plan. They went with a 1-4 alignment, where they would have 4 players lined up along the blue line, and they would have their center, whether it was Bobby Clarke or Rick McLeish or whoever was at center, as the attacking forward. So that kind of threw the Russians off their game, because no one had played that kind of style before. And it was interesting because Shero, as innovative as he was, kind of reached back into history for that, because that was a tactic that had been used by Hap Day and the Toronto Maple Leafs when they were winning Stanley Cups back in the early 40s. They had used a similar style 1-4 alignment, and it was interesting that Shero, who was very much a forward thinker, kind of reached back into history to use that kind of strategy to blunt the Soviets' attack.
Well, I'm sure Valery Harlamov was really looking forward to seeing Bobby Clark again from that 72 series.
Yeah.
But ironically, Harlamov was part of let's call it the incident. I wonder if Clark was either jealous or thankful not to be part of it. You want to describe and set the tone for what became pretty much the flashpoint of this game in the first period.
Yeah. And it had started actually before that. The Flyers started getting physical not long into that game, and it started with a hit delivered by Moose Dupont on Alexander Gusev at the Flyers' blue line. And that, I mean, the crowd was into the game right from the first puck drop, but when you watch the game on video, I mean, the crowd noise goes through the roof when Dupont drops Gusev at the blue line. And that seemed to energize not only the crowd, but the other Flyer players, because then, Bill Barber upends Harlamov in the corner, and the Flyers start really taking the body against the Russian players who, at that time, the Soviets played more of a European style, so it was more of a finesse game. And the Flyers were hitting them pretty hard, cleanly, but also pretty hard. And then, you had the situation where Eddie Van Impe, one of the Flyers defensemen, comes out of the penalty box, and Harlamov is going down the right side of the rink, and he doesn't see Van Impe coming toward him, and Harlamov reaches back to get a pass, and he runs into Eddie Van Impe's upraised elbow/shoulder and is dropped to the ice. Harlamov is face down on the ice, and Konstantin Loktev, the Russian coach, calls for the referee, Lord Gilmore, to issue a penalty. Gilmore refused, saying it's a clean check, and Harlamov is still down on the ice, and that's when Loktev calls his players over to the bench and says, we're leaving, we're out of here, because the Flyers are playing what he called animal hockey. And he's there. We didn't come to Philadelphia for a boxing match. We came for a hockey game. So that's when they left the ice. But when you talk to the Flyers, to them, it was just a clean check. It's the kind of check that they saw in NHL games all the time. Eddie Van Impe said he hit guys much harder in the NHL and they never went down. He said Harlamov was, basically being a Hamlet, being an actor. And Jimmy Watson, Flyers defenseman, skated over where Harlamov was lying on the ice and yelled at him to get up. You're not really hurt. And so
was he?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Was he hurt?
Well, he returned and played the rest of the game. So, the Russians were known for
dramatizing.
Yes, exactly, and using tactics to again, get man advantages, get power plays, anything to do that they could get, an advantage, that they would do it. I'm sure the hit was hard enough to maybe, knock him off stride or something, whether it's hard enough for him to be face down on the ice for as long as he was. At least the Flyers didn't think so. And the announcers, I know Dennis Potvin of the Islanders was one of the announcers for that game, and he said that it was a clean check. And, it didn't look like Harlamov had been hit hard enough to be, down for such a long time.
Referee agreed, right, that it was a clean check. And so, I mean, what ultimately happened? I mean, they sort of stormed off, and Snyder got involved, yelling and screaming, everybody shades of 72 all over again when they were, that was it the fifth game in Russia, in Soviet Union, all kinds of, or maybe the sixth game, I forget what it was, but there was a game in that series, right, where it was just mayhem, right, and people, protesting and walking off and all that kind of stuff, all the drama and stuff, but it didn't really work out. It almost backfired, if you will, because once they came back, Philadelphia just kind of resumed playing and kind of took over from there. It was scoreless before that incident happened, right?
It was scoreless. And, it should be stated that this was not the first time the Russians had left the ice in protest in international competition. They had done that before, and the Flyers had actually been warned before the game. Several days before the game, they were warned by NHL brass that, this might happen during the game. There might be a hard check or two where the Russians protest and they're going to leave the ice. Just stay cool. Don't worry about it. They're going to come back and play. So just don't worry about it. So, so what happened, to backtrack just a little bit, is that they go into their respective locker rooms and the NHL brass rushes to meet Locktab to see what's going on, and they're all talking through interpreters. And Locktab is telling them, we're not going to play against this kind of hockey. And they wanted Gilmore to assess a penalty. Gilmore instead assessed a delay of game penalty on him, which meaning the Flyers were going to be on the power play when play resumed. And Ed Snyder said that if you don't play, you don't get paid. And it was at that point, as the story goes, that Locktab said, "Oh, okay, we'll finish out this game." But Locktab has said since then that the Russians had been paid in advance, so money wasn't really a factor. So again, that goes back and forth to what you want to believe there. I spoke with Larry Goodenough, who was one of the Flyers players, and he was down the hall. He heard the conversation between Snyder and the Russians, and he heard Ed Snyder yelling at the Russians that if you don't come back to the ice, you're not getting paid. So whether they knew that the Russians had been paid in advance, I'm not sure about that. But either way, they did return, and Flyers were on the man advantage, and they took advantage of it and got a goal past Tretiak and took a 1-0 lead.
And they kind of never looked back. It was a 4-1 victory at the end, but true to form, right? They were the Flyers, wildly outshot the Red Army team. It seems like that it only became more, more of a frenzy in the Forum as the game sort of went on and stuff. Why do you think the game, though, at the end of all of it, and the drama that sort of was part of it, why do you think it kind of took on sort of more meaning than the actual game itself? I mean, the victory in such a thorough fashion and winning, if you will, sort of the stand down in the first period and all that. It seems to me like that by itself might have been enough, but you go another step further to say that this really had another sort of level to it in terms of its importance.
Yeah, it really kind of marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. At the end of the season, the Flyers returned for a third straight Stanley Cup final. They lost to the Canadiens in 4 games, but that's a little misleading because 3 of the 4 games were decided by a goal. The Flyers did not have 2 of their top players. Goalie Bernie Parent did not play in the series, and their second-line center, Rick McLeish, was also out. And McLeish had always been a very productive postseason player for the Flyers. And most people I've talked to agree that, if the Flyers had been at full strength, that series, might have gone their way. But, the Canadiens won. They went on to win 4 straight Stanley Cups. It really marked the end of the Broad Street Bullies. Eddie Van Impe was traded even before the end of the season. And then you had Dave Schultz was traded at the end of the season. So this idea of the Flyers being enforcers and everything kind of, started to go away a little bit. And by the time they returned to the Cup finals in the 79-80 season against the Islanders, it was a vastly different kind of Flyers team, especially from the point of view of, hockey purists. They were no longer the Broad Street Bullies. They were just like the Philadelphia Flyers. They didn't have that identity anymore. But, it marked a change too, because, I think both sides realized that they had to change a little bit to keep improving. The Russians realized they had to get more physical. They had to start taking the body more, engaging in more physical checks. They had to get away from that strategic passing that they did so much of. The stop playing so much east to west and start playing north to south, like the Flyers in the NHL did. And the NHL and the Flyers realized that they in turn had to improve their conditioning to be better conditioned as the Russian players were. They had to train year round. They had to improve their style of play too. Maybe go a little more to strategic passing and less to the dump and chase. So you saw a melding of two, different ways of playing hockey, two outlooks. The European style and the North American style started to come together more. And by the time the Iron Curtain fell and the Berlin Wall came down, now you had Russian players and European players coming into the NHL, and it really became a global league, which is what it is now. And you see it's less any one style, it's more a melding of styles now. The European style and the North American style have come together to form, the NHL as we know it today.
Yeah, it's interesting too. There's a little funny component, unique, interesting tidbit here on the in the game. Maybe you can describe it a little bit. Coach Shiro was amazed, I think, that Joe Watson, who was a defenseman and not a major scorer by any stretch, if you look at the stats over his career, he got a shorthanded goal against this team and perhaps against one of the greatest goalkeepers at that time in Tretiak.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't think of another more humiliating component there than that. It's almost an exclamation point.
Yeah. And, Joe Watson told me that, after the game, Shiro told him, hey, you just set the Russian hockey program back 20 years with that goal. And it was like, well, and years later, Joe Watson went to Moscow and was asked about the Soviet, Flyers game in '76 by, Moscow teenagers. And Joe was like, you guys are too young to know anything about that game. They like, oh, we know everything about that game. That's talked about a lot over here. And this is just, this is decades after the game was played. And Joe had another funny story where they saw like a chain gang prisoners in Russia working, and Joe asked one of the guards, why are these guys here? And they said, oh, they were on the ice when you scored your goal.
I wonder how the remnants of that hockey program there kind of took that, and it's clearly it's an event on their radars, probably not unlike the 72 and to a lesser extent the 74 Summit series as well, right? Because it was just against that sort of Iron Curtain backdrop, right? I mean, these games, right, but all these series, right, were not just hockey affairs, but these were in certain cases pretty well seen, but in both countries and maybe even further than that. These were pretty big deals in the hockey world and in some respect the sports world, just because of the tension of the international intrigue between these two nations.
Yeah. And I spoke with Arthur Chidlovsky, who is probably the world's leading historian on Russian hockey. He grew up in Moscow. He was a young teenager at that time, and he remembers he received permission from his mom to stay up late and watch that game. And he said everybody in Moscow was watching that game, and they were fascinated by the sight of their league champions, the Central Red Army team, on the same ice as the Philadelphia Flyers, the Broad Street Bullies. It was just something that they had never thought they would ever see, and here it was. And it just captured the imagination of an entire country and both countries, and throughout Europe. It was a huge deal because it was, the Soviet Union saw their sports program, and especially their hockey program, as extensions of their political system, their way of life. And if they could beat North American teams, then to them, communism was better than capitalism. And their way of life was superior to the way of life here in North America. And that's the pressure that both of these teams were under when they came together for that one game in January 76. And, I should also note, too, that it was so pressure packed because it was just a one game showdown. It wasn't, a best of 7 series like the Stanley Cup final. It was just one game. And, if you didn't play your best, or if you didn't have a good game that day, there was no coming back for a game 2 the next day. I mean, it was all or nothing in this one game. And that's why, like I said, no NHL team will ever have to face the pressure that the Flyers did for that game. And for them to play as disciplined as they did against the Soviets, I think was a tribute to Freddie Shiro's coaching and a tribute to those players who, they were much more than the Broad Street Bullies. I mean, they were a tough, talented, skilled, disciplined team, because you don't win back-to-back Stanley Cups just by beating up people. I mean, you have to have skill, you have to have talent, and they had all of that.
Plus, they had Kate Smith singing the national anthem, for God's sakes. I mean, come on, with all that going for you.
Yeah.
What of besides interviewing people who were there or have distinct memories of all that and stuff, what of this game, if anything, is remembered, commemorated, physically visible, if anything, in Philadelphia about this game? Or is it kind of just something that's in the lore and one has to be a super fan to kind of really recognize it? Is there any recognition of that game? Anybody, did they do any commemorative events or any of that kind of thing for this match?
I think on the anniversary of it, they remember it like, every 10 years or so. The only Flyers statue in Center City, Philly, is one of Bobby Clark and Bernie Parent hoisting the Stanley Cup. And I should mention, too, that, Bernie Parent was the best goalie in NHL at that time, and he did not play in the game against the Soviets. He was injured. So they went with the backup goalie, Wayne Stevenson, who played a terrific game. But yeah, as far as anniversaries go, every 10 years, when it's January 11th again, you'll see an article appear somewhere on it. But other than that, I think the Russians might remember it more because of, some of the things I spoke about before, how teenagers in Moscow, were talking to Joe Watson about this game. And, it was decades after the fact that it had already been played. And so, yeah, I mean, they remember the time that their league champions, who they thought were the best team in the world, went to Philadelphia and lost against, the Broad Street Bullies.
All right, here's my last question, and I'll let you promote. It's interesting. I mean, so much has happened since then. Certainly on the geopolitical front, right? Obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 80s, and the various iterations of what has come since then, what is now sort of known essentially as a loose federation, if you will, depending on your political perspective of Russia. But it's still interesting to see that the NHL and what is now the KHL, the Continental with a K, Hockey League, are really considered to be the two leading professional leagues on the world stage still, and probably there's a gap of difference and debatable for sure. I'm just curious, given that sort of the 70s decade, which seemed to be just fraught with tension on the global front, but also a desire, a hunger for these two, shall we call them, hockey adversaries, both from a country perspective as well as a league perspective, to play each other and prove each other that they were superior or better or more competitive or whatever. I'm just surprised that here in 2023 there isn't more a similar competitive tournaments or cross-pollination, shall we say, of teams playing each other, given this how the game is globalized. And again, I'm putting politics and war and other issues aside. I'm just talking specifically about these two hockey leagues, right? I'm wondering why perhaps there hasn't been more ongoing competition between at least these two leagues, because they're still arguably where the predominant amount of talent and highest quality of play in the world live.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I think, I'm not sure if you can actually take politics out of it. I mean, we've seen,
Yeah, I realize that.
Yeah, and we've seen teams, not participate in the Olympics because of politics. Of course, famous 1980 U.S. boycott. So, unfortunately, politics is always going to be a part of it. Politics in sports predates even what happened between the U.S. and Russia in hockey. I mean, you go back to famous fights in international history. Joe Louis against Max Schmeling, that was fraught with international politics. I mean, the radio audience for that fight included Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, that's how big that fight was. So international politics are always big, are always taking place when you have these big events, when warranted. But as far as the two leagues, I don't think it can ever go back to what it was, because Russian players now are known commodities. I mean, they're known personnel. They've been in the NHL for decades now. They're no longer mysterious visitors like they were back in the 70s. We know all about Russian hockey now. We didn't know much about it back then. Nobody ever saw it. There wasn't ESPN back then. You didn't see Russian hockey players anywhere, except for the Olympics every 4 years. And, that was basically a one-shot deal. So, you didn't have the coverage. You didn't have the reputations. I mean, basically all you knew about them was what you read. And now all of a sudden here they are. They show up in North America during the bicentennial year of all things. And, they're here to take on the best of the NHL. And, again, I think that's what really made this such a unique and special series, was because of that unknown, factor. It was something new. It was something different. It was unique. Who knew if it would ever happen again? It did, but it was years later. And, it was, anytime you have something like that, it's going to be groundbreaking.
Yeah. And again, I don't mean to dismiss sort of what's going on, today on the global stage, right? I mean, there's no doubt that's more of a pipe dream, I guess, of hockey fans than anything else at this stage. But it was interesting. I remember a couple of years ago when there was this thing called One World Sports, which was this fledgling cable network in the United States that was kind of predicated on global sports, bringing sort of leagues from various nations and countries all over the place, and started creating a world sports kind of channel. And one of the highlights of that programming was KHL games, and they were broadcast live. And I think Ed Cohen in New York, a famous sportscaster there in the local area, would be there, calling these games live at 4 a.m, from off of a feed somewhere up in Connecticut. And the quality of play, I mean, it was stunning, frankly. I mean, to the average NHL fan, I think, who hasn't really seen a KHL game, I can't believe how widely dispersed geographically these teams are. Obviously, that's just because of the gigantic size of the country. But it's just interesting that, you arguably still have the best leagues out there in these two countries. And I don't know if anything's been solved. I mean, I would imagine the NHL fancies itself as the NBA and as the global powerhouse. I'm not so sure. I think the NBA is a little different when it comes to basketball than the NHL is when it comes to hockey. I don't think there's any dispute that the NHL is the world's best league, but I think the KHL and maybe even some European players and leagues might think that there's a little bit more, I wouldn't call it parity, but a little bit more competitiveness perhaps than, say, where the NBA is or Major League Baseball is relative to the various leagues around the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think the NHL has always had that, idea that they are, the best in the world. And I think they came to a pretty shocking realization back in the 72 Summit Series that, hey, there's not a lot of difference between our best and the best in the Soviet Union. And, when other players from, throughout Europe started to come into the NHL, I mean, they were NHL superstars. And, I think the league started to realize that they didn't corner the market on hockey talent. There's hockey talent throughout Europe. There's hockey talent in Russia, and, I think that they, kind of scaled back their ideas that, only the best hockey was played here in North America. That I think they realized that, there is great hockey being played in, Russia and throughout Europe. And, I remember a quote from Wayne Gretzky, during the one of the Summit Series in the 80s. And he said that, people need to realize that, there's great hockey here in North America and there's great hockey in the Soviet Union too. So, and I think it was true then, and I think it's still true today.
All right. Our thanks to Ed for that chat. The book is called The Game That Saved the NHL, The Broad Street Bullies, The Soviet Red Machine, and Super Series 76. It is published by Lions Press, and it is available wherever you find good books, perhaps down the street at your local independent bookseller, or perhaps by going to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, searching up this episode number 322 with Ed Gruver and yours truly, and you will find a convenient link to this book, courtesy of our friends at Amazon. You get the hardcover edition, you can get the Kindle edition, and by doing so and purchasing it that manner, you will be giving us a couple of shekels of referral love. We'd appreciate that kindly. Help us keep the heat on in these cold winter months as we work our fingers to the bone to get you these episodes each and every week. We, again, appreciate that to no end. You can send us email if you'd like. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Be sure to subscribe and follow us wherever you find podcasts, so make sure you get every stinking episode of this extravaganza for you. And if you can't find it in your podcast player of preference, please let us know. I doubt it's hard to find, but if it somehow is, just let us know. We'll try to correct that situation. You can follow us on social media of various sorts. You'll find us on X/Twitter at Good Seats Still, and all the other socials. You'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. Those are places like Threads and Instagram and what am I trying to say? Facebook, yes, and YouTube. Those are all, you can follow us there, and all those places at Good Seats Still Available. Got it? So it's Good Seats Still for X/Twitter, and every place else that we are around at Good Seats Still Available. Our thanks, of course, to the great Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. Once again, knob twiddling extraordinaire. We appreciate that too. And we, of course, cannot thank you enough for listening, telling your friends, subscribing, and doing whatever it is to get the word out about the show. And you tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on. We appreciate that very, very much. Stay warm, everybody. Enjoy the snow. And we will see you next week, God willing. Thanks for listening. Bye.